Physical scientists who become interested in biological problems, a subset of them have difficulty embracing the evolutionary constraints and complexity of biology. And this keeps them from really having an impact on the field of biology. But the best ones engage with the details of biology while still looking for understanding at the level that's expected in the physical sciences. So Christof Koch, who'll give the last lecture of the symposium, is certainly in this latter group. A one-time physicist, Christof is now president and chief executive officer of the Allen Brain Institute, which is having a transformative influence not only on computational neuroscience, but also on experimental neurobiology. So I was a PhD student in Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, when Christof arrived in 1987 as an assistant professor, and Lee Hood was the head of department at that time. So coming from Tommaso Poggio's lab at MIT, and also previously from the Max-Planck-Institut for Biocybernetics, Christof had very strong connections to the tradition of physicists turned biologists at Caltech, a list that included Linus Pauling, Seymour Benzer, and particularly to Max Delbruck. So not surprisingly, Christof fits seamlessly into this community. So I'd like to show a slide which is of Christof and his kids, which I discovered in my collection, a picture that I took at a party in Max and Manny Delbruck's backyard about 30 years ago. So it appears that, interestingly, that the first PhD student, or one of the first to start working with Christof, was Max Delbruck's son, Toby Delbruck, and who sort of assures me that Christof won't mind if I share this story with you. So one Sunday morning, Toby and I went over to the Romans bookshop in Pasadena looking for some novels to buy, and we found Christof in one of the aisles looking at a rather thick book, and we wandered over, and Toby looked over his shoulder and found it was something about Heidegger. And so Toby said, "Oh, Christof, is that fun?" And Christof said, "Fun? You think this is fun?" And we sort of retreated at that point and went and purchased our books, and 10 minutes later we came back. And we found Christof, so we had no opportunity to avoid him. We had to walk past him again. We found him still looking at his book, but muttering under his breath, "Fun?" So at a visceral level, we realized that while we were out there looking for a spot of entertainment, we had actually interrupted an intellectual animal at his kill. So while it was attending to its hunger for information and slaking its thirst for deep understanding. So perhaps a formative influence for Christof at Caltech was his membership in the Helmholtz Club in Southern California, an outfit that I think has had an inordinate amount of influence in cognitive neuroscience. So it was founded in the 1980s by Francis Crick, who was both patron and founding pillar, and it included people with expertise going all the way from neuroanatomy, neurophysiology to engineering. So some of the members include V.S. Ramachandran, John Allman, Terry Sajnowski, John Hopfield, Carver Mead, and Christof Koch. And all of them shared an interest in understanding vision, as well as cognitive functions that rely on visual perception and consciousness. So this, I would like to think, influenced Christof, who had worked previously before Caltech in extraordinary depth on the biophysics of neurons, simulating action, potential propagation, and axons and dendrites. So at Caltech, he and his group became a major hub for the new computational neuroscience program, which had just begun. They simulated and modeled the properties of single neurons, neural circuits, and processes at increasingly higher levels of complexity. So particularly stunning was his work showing how bottom-up mechanisms, starting from sensory neurons in the retina, could lead to the final assignment of visual salience, that is to select out salient objects, and selective attention in the brain. So a synthesis of this work he wrote with his postdoc, Lawrence Itty, is among the most cited papers in the field of attention. So in addition to influencing several really great neuroscientists who went through his lab, I know several terrific young scientists who attribute their research direction now to the methods in computational neuroscience summer in the summer course in the marine biological labs in Woods Hole, and also to the neuromorphic engineering summer school in Telluride, Colorado, that Christof started and initiated some 25, 30 years ago, and have still been held every year since. So despite all of his various contributions that Christof has made, he's now best known, or probably most visible, for his work on consciousness. He writes a regular column for Scientific American called Consciousness Redux, and he's also written several books, including most recently, Consciousness, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. So before I end, I'd like to show one more slide. It's actually 2 slides down. And this is of Christof not so many years ago, doing a hugely impressive Tyrolean traverse high above Yosemite Valley. So I think this picture serves as a metaphor for Schrödinger and for Christof, both of whom seem compelled with the courage and desire to take a leap and explore the biological unknown, while still staying connected to Earth by the steel links made of fundamental physical science. So to deliver the 2018 Schrödinger lecture entitled The Future of Consciousness, please welcome Christof Koch.
Thank you much. That was wow, what a day. So I'm a neuroscientist, and we have a technical expression in the field that says, my brain is full, when you just have to listen to so many awesome lectures over the last 2 days. I've also noted, and I have a private suspicion, maybe one of the reasons I was invited here, I seem to be the only one who can correctly pronounce the name of the physicist in whose honor we are here. Now, you can all speak after me. It's Erwin Schrödinger, with an R and an umlaut. All right, so I have the challenge of talking about not only about consciousness, but the future of consciousness. So I'm just going to briefly define it. A lot of people claim it's very difficult to define. It's actually very easy to define, because it's any possible experience. Any experience like this one, you're looking at something, I'm looking out at you, you're looking back at me, that's an experience. If you remember tomorrow, that's an experience. If you now, your back is beginning to hurt because you've been sitting here all day, that's another experience. If you think, if you cast your mind back, what was some of the previous points or slides that a viewer showed, that's an experience. You can be aware that you're having an experience. That's a particular class of experience called self-consciousness, but it's just a small subset of the much larger universe of all possible experiences. You can think about yourself, and most interestingly, at least for some of us, you can have what Buddhists call a naked awareness, pure experience, sheer experience, when you are, for instance, in an immersion tank or particular types of meditation, when you're conscious, so you're not asleep, you're conscious, but there's no content, there's no desire, no dream, no fear, no ego, no sensory messages, but you're still conscious, pure consciousness, very interesting. So I've divided this talk into 3 sections, the past, the present, and the future. So the past. So much of certainly what I learned in philosophy can be dated back, goes back to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, particular dispute between the first and still one of the most influential philosophers or scientists or biologists. He was all 3 of them: Aristotle in the middle, who points downward, and Plato, who points upwards. And a number of times, ideas I'm going to refer to Aristotle, because he not only thought about how to define biological creatures, he thought how to define parts and whole. He had very interesting ideas about the soul and about the critical role of causal powers to explain existence of anything, whether it's external existence or internal existence, like my experience. So from my point of view, the most relevant and also the most famous deduction in Western thought is, of course, Je pense donc je suis by René Descartes, that he formulated roughly 350 years ago. He used this, he was in this mindful of doubting everything. And he wanted to ascertain to himself, what is it that he could not deny? What was a few facts that were true beyond any doubt? And the only thing he could conclude, because he was conscious, he expands on this later on this je pense, it's later on, of course, translated into cogito ergo sum, on modern language, I'm conscious, therefore I exist, is that because he had conscious experiences, he could be deluded about the nature. He could be like Neo, remember Neo in Matrix, who was, of course, totally deluded at first because he thought he lived in the real world, where in reality he was stacked in this double-D battery by these aliens. But the fact that Neo had experiences could not be doubted, so he existed. And you can go back and find earlier statements of this in St. Augustine or even in Aristotle. He also introduced us to a way of the thinking that's not been very productive, but it's been very, very powerful for the past 350 years, namely what we today refer as Cartesian dualism. The idea is that everything in existence falls into one of two categories. Either it has extension, it's physical stuff, res extensa, or it's mental stuff, res cogitans. And famously, he, of course, argued that only humans have it, that animals are pure machines, and humans have this special thing, this cognitive stuff. And this entire way of thinking about the world of the material and the world of the mental has not been very productive in terms of well, on the one hand, it's led to the spectacular origin of physics, so it has been very successful, but in terms of trying to understand the mind-body problem, it's been disastrous. The main problem with this view of thinking about the mind is that how does the mind, this ineffable thing, interact with matter? So it's a very uneasy marriage of two things that don't really interact with each other. So that's always been the problem. Now, I, like many of us, so I got my copy of the book, this is the original copy I bought in 1977 when I was an undergrad. I was terribly influenced by it. And in fact, in this book, there are two books. One is Mind and Matter, a series of lectures he wrote in 1956. They were published in 1958, and he makes two very relevant comments. One is this: the strange fact that on the one hand, all of our knowledge about the world around us, both that gained in everyday life and that revealed by the most carefully planned and painstaking lab experiments, rests entirely on immediate sense perception, while on the other hand, this knowledge fails to reveal the relation of the sense perception to the outside world, so that in the picture or model we form of the outside world, guided by our scientific discoveries, all sensual qualities are absent. What he means to say by that experience is prior to physics. The only way I access anything is through my experiences. And from my experiences, I abduce. It's a deductive, probabilistic inference that people today call abduction. I abduce the existence of an external world because I do not have direct access to this external world. All I have access to is the pain, the mechanical sensation of the external world, right? So I abduce the existence of an external world, including the existence of other people and stars and dogs and atoms and viruses and black holes and whatnot. But that's all indirect. It's a very powerful abduction, but it's indirect. The only thing I know for certain I have access to, I have direct acquaintance with, are this picture in my head, the sounds inside my skull, all my various feelings. And so if we want to achieve a complete picture, if we want to have a complete scientific view of the world, not just of the external world, of black holes and viruses and quantum mechanics and all that good stuff, but also my own consciousness, we have to reconcile those two aspects of our world. And this was very much the program that Francis Crick and I embarked upon. You heard Mani say, so when I came to Caltech in 1986, I very quickly fell in with Francis Crick, and we had a very productive 16-year-long, very intense relationship, including publishing 20 papers. He gave me this tie that I'm wearing in his honor. It's a DNA tie. It's made by the artist Niki de Saint-Phal, and that is Francis' gift, one of his gifts to me. So the present. So what we started at the time was sort of what today seems perfectly obvious, is a search for what people now call the NCC, the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So here you are walking in the world, you see a dog, you become conscious of the dog, and something has to happen in your body. Not only in your body, we now know since 400 years roughly, it's in your head, not just anywhere in your head, but particularly in your cerebral cortex. Something has to happen. and so what has to happen, we call it, because we're careful scientists, a neuronal correlate of consciousness. And so we can, in order for you to see, to have this particular percept. And you can ask, for instance, what is common about the percept of a dog here and a dog there, or a dog here and a dog here, or a dog and a cat, and what's common between the NCC for seeing a dog versus hearing a dog bark, or closing my eyes and imagining my dog, right? These are all different conscious experiences, and we can ask, what is common? Is it always the same neurons that are active, consciousness neurons? Or is it a particular mode that neurons operate in a particular mode, like they at 40 hertz, or they're all synchronized? These are all various proposals people have made. And how do they relate to the different sensory modalities? What happens if you, for example, have a loss of consciousness, like if you have a specific stroke and you lose a particular class of percepts? For example, you're unable to see color, unable to see motion. What happens in animals, what happens under anesthesia. So this search for the NCC is a very vibrant research program that you can carry out and that many people now do. So this is how we define it. It's the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient for any one conscious percept. And it's a causal node. So for every conscious percept, there will be an NCC, no matter how obtuse. If you think you live in late-stage capitalist society and you really have a feeling for that, well, there's going to be some neural mechanism. You can, and it's a causal notion, because if you induce the NCC, for instance, using optogenetics of the type pioneered by Karl Deiserov, you will induce a perception. Conversely, if you inactivate the NCC again by optogenetics or drugs or TMS or some other device, you will eliminate the NCC, and therefore you'll eliminate the conscious percept. So it's a research strategy for doing a whole bunch of research in humans using primarily non-invasive tools like brain scanning and EEG and MEG and all these other things, and in people and in animals using invasive technology. So this is, for example, this is a typical experiment. I flash up very briefly this faint phase, only, let's say, 50 milliseconds. And half the time, you see actually a phase, and half the time you don't, for various factors intrinsic to your brain, partly because it's a noisy system. And so now you can collect all the time when you saw the phase. You push a yes button, and you collect all the times when you didn't see it, and you do a contrast between those two brain states. And then you can, for example, see here in this cartoon, you can see a set of cortical areas, so-called extrastriate cortex, fusiform gyrus, and prefrontal cortex that are active. Now, of course, you have to be very careful. The art of the experiment is that there are many possible confounds. One confound is pressing the button. Maybe this response is just because I pressed yes versus no, so you have to control for that. You have to control for attention. Attention is not the same as consciousness, as we now know. You can attend to things that you don't see. You can attend to invisible things. You have to control for that. You have to control for the task. You have to control for the fact that the person sitting there and having to remember which button to press. All those things you have to control for. But this is the ingenuity of modern neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. People can do all of that. And then you can do a different experiment where you just contrast being conscious. Let's say you line the magnet, your eyes are closed, you're not thinking of anything particular, versus being, for example, in deep sleep, stage 3, or anesthetized. And then again, you can look at the differences. This is done much more often in the clinic. The first one is sort of more done in the lab. And conceptually, you have to distinguish the causal factors that you can direct consciously manipulate to induce a phase percept, to make you believe there's a phase there when actually you don't do it, which neurosurgeons can do by now stimulating particular regions in the fusiform gyrus with electrodes that they have put there because they need to monitor onset of epileptic seizures for more general arousal factors. We know there's a number of things that have to go on for you to be capable of having any experiences. Your heart has to beat. We know if your heart doesn't beat, within 10 seconds you're faint. Your lung has to pump air into the lungs and endow oxygen to the red blood cells. Otherwise, again, very quickly you become unconscious. There's a whole bevy. We now know it's a very complicated set of 40 or 50 different nuclei with different specific neurotransmitters have to be active in the brainstem. That's a tube like 2-inch long, maybe a little bit less than an inch thick. That is absolutely essential for conscious life, for regulation, for all sorts of things. If you have stroke there, it's typically bad news. You can have a stroke in cortex and lose specific aspects of conscious perception, like you can lose a class of having body ownership, of seeing colors or something. But if you lose something down, if you have a stroke in the brainstem, you typically are unconscious. So what this tells us, that here these mechanisms are necessary for consciousness, but they're really background condition. This is not where the content of consciousness is provided, the colors, the sound that make up a lived life. They're provided upstairs by a structure I'll talk to in a minute. So we know there are a whole bunch of parts of the neural system that do not give rise to consciousness, that are not NCC. And that's very interesting because we can then ask, well, where's the difference? The spinal cord, so we know this, right? This is a Superman actor who had a stroke from he took a fall and he was paralyzed for the rest of his life. Christopher Reeves, he was fully conscious, and we know this from lots of such accident victims, that you can lose the 200 million neurons down here, your life is changed forever, but your conscious perception doesn't change. So wherever the mechanisms are that give rise to consciousness, they're not here. They're not in the eye. Artists pointed this out in the 19th century. You do not see with the eye, you see with your brain. There are many reasons for this. One of them is, for example, we know we have a blind spot, yet we don't see the blind spot. We constantly move our eyes 3 to 4 times every second, yet your vision is very stable. It's really a job by higher order centers, not by the retina. Then there is a most striking structure at the back of our brain called the cerebellum, the little brain. Ironically, it carries more neurons than anywhere else. So 80% of all your cells, 80% plus of all your neurons are in the cerebellum. The cerebellum has some of the most glorious neurons ever. I mean, Purkinje cell. They're freaking awesome. They're this coral-shaped, beautiful morphology. Even I, not working in a cerebellum, have to admit they are the most beautiful cells. They have very complicated internal spike dynamics, calcium dynamics. They have, the cerebellum has input maps, has output maps. It has all the stuff that the rest of the brain has. But if you lose bits and pieces of it, I was just recently talking to a neurological resident. He just had 3 months ago an operation where, due to brain cancer, the surgeons had to take out 3 by 3 by 4. That's a piece of cerebellum that's roughly this volume. And I asked him, I spent a lot of time talking with him, where's the difference? Do you have different experiences? Is the character of your experience different? Do you see different? Do you smell different? Do you remember different? Do you have a different self-consciousness? No. The main thing is he couldn't play piano anymore, and he could only type very slow on his iPhone. And we know that, and there are some individuals, like this lady in China, who have a very rare condition. They're born without a cerebellum altogether. And they're clearly conscious. They have various other deficits. It's not good to be born without a cerebellum. But they do not complain of loss of consciousness. And again, this gives rise to the question, well, why not? Where's the difference? Many people think, oh, consciousness, that's just neurons sort of doing their stuff. It happens automatically. Well, it doesn't. Something else seems to be involved. The key culprit is this piece of tissue. It's a 2-dimensional sheet. I call it 2 plus epsilon dimensional because it expanded by evolution across probably 100,000 times in size, from tiny itsy-bitsy in a mice to a 14-inch pizza in us, to a 22-inch pizza in whales. The thickness hasn't changed so much. So there you have it. It's really a sheet of neurons, the cortical sheet, and it gives rise to higher order percept, to thoughts, to intelligence, to reasoning, and to consciousness. We know this. The character of the evidence that I won't discuss really in detail is lesion studies. So we can infer you have to be very careful about it for all sorts of reasons, but people who come to the clinic and who lose particular bits and pieces of the brain and then have particular loss of particular function, that tells us something about the location of that function. We also have strong causal evidence from stimulation. So since roughly 100 years or so, neurosurgeons stimulate the brain using typically microelectrodes, now sometimes more advanced tools like ultrasound and magnetic pulses, but traditionally with electrical pulses. So we know we can stimulate conscious percept in particular parts of the brain, and we cannot stimulate in other parts of the brain. And then more recently, albeit weaker from an evidentiary point of view, is correlational evidence from putting people in magnetic scanner. So this is typically the bulk of my standard academic talks, but this is just one slide. And the only thing I want to tell you that all the evidence points toward a region that we call the posterior hot zone, the back part of cerebral cortex, as being critically involved when you whether it's a visual percept, whether it's an auditory percept, whether it's a somatosensory percept, those have been best studied, or whether it's a feeling of intentionality. So particular neurosurgeons have stimulated these regions, and people get feelings of agency and of wanting to do things. So the feeling of, I want to do this, I want to do that, you can induce that by electrical stimulation to the back part of the brain. It's very interesting. Now, of course, this immediately gives rise to the question, why here and what not here? It's all cortex. Where's the difference? Very interesting question that we can talk about later. People have also invented now tools to measure the presence or absence of consciousness. This is a very, very recent development. It essentially uses, what it does, it zaps the brain with pulses of magnetic energy, perturbs the brain. So think of a bell, and you hit the bell with a hammer, and you're now listening for the reverberations. You listen to the reverberation by placing EEG electrode on the brain and then looking at the complexity of the responses. And essentially, it's called zap and zip. You zap the brain, and then you use the Lempel-Ziff compression algorithm, that's just for the nerds, in order to test, is this patient conscious or not? It's not easy to tell always in anesthesia, because there's up to 2 to 3% of people who have so-called awakening anesthesia, and they can't tell you that because separately they're paralyzed. Plus, of course, there are many patients who are in hovering somewhere between coma, minimal conscious state, persistent vegetative state, where it's not really clear whether there's anybody home. So it's really very important to develop such practical clinical tool to test for the presence of consciousness in humans. This is now in various clinical stages being tried, as well as trying to apply the same methods to animals like monkeys and mice, where you can, with very precise spatial and temporal and genetic precision, turn off specific parts of the brain on and off, like Dijsselhoff showed yesterday, and then measure the presence or absence of consciousness by looking at the amount of differentiation and integration in the cortical sheet. So that's done here in the clinical study. Now here you see two mammals. I'm sorry, Emma, Emma is wrong. The most interesting animals besides us are, of course, not bats, but dogs. So I assume, well, I've yet to meet, maybe there's one here in the audience, I've yet to meet a dog owner or cat owner who does not assume that their cat has experiences, is conscious. So how do we abuse consciousness in others? Well, it's an abductive process. I really don't know that you're conscious, right? I have to infer you could be a zombie, but I infer this. Now, I can't even use language always, because if you're a baby, I can't ask you. If you had a stroke, or you're severely demented, I can't ask you, but you still seem to be conscious. So same thing with non-human animals. We abuse consciousness in others because the behavior is similar, it's not identical. They have things like very complicated emotion. We all know the emotional lives of animals. The brain architecture is so similar. So I run an institute with 330 people. We did an all-staff meeting recently where I showed them 12 pictures, one after the other, of human cortical cells and mouse cortical cells. I removed the scale bar. Even though these are many neuroanatomists and other people who every day record from brain cells, people are chance telling a little bit of brain tissue from a mouse, from a human. It's not the same, but it's all very, very similar. We have more of it. But of course, other creatures like whales have even more of it. We're also all closely related. The main difference is we have true language. We have a very sophisticated sense of self as adults, not as kids. And we have an overly developed sense of importance. Particularly in the West, where, of course, human exceptionalism is present very, very strong. It's different among, for example, if you hang out with Tibetan Buddhists. So now this gives rise to a question. This is the tree of life. You've seen a number of them already. This is the Hillis plot I prefer. So the last universal common organism, Luca, is here. And all extant species, every living species is outside here on this tree of life that, of course, has millions or so of leaves. I only show a few. The mammals, we're here. Gorgeous Bernese Mountain Dog. That's all the mammals. And from all the complexity of the behavior, there's no shadow of a doubt that it feels like something to be a cat, a dog, a mouse. The mouse doesn't have an inner voice like I do because it doesn't have language. But there's no question. It feels, it sees, it senses, it can be afraid. It shows all the same manifestation. And dog, of course, that's why we hang out with them, because we have this close emotional, bidirectional emotional affinity. But of course, there are lots of other complicated animals that have architectures very different. These guys, corvids, right? Amazing feats of memory, very complicated cognitive function. They don't have a cortex. They have sort of an homolog structure called the wolves, but they don't have a cortex. Cephalopods, they are totally separate bands. They're invertebrates, right? If you just go on YouTube and look at some of their capability, what octopus can do, they're amazingly complex, with amazingly complex brain. Even a humble bee. I love bees. In a tiny volume of under a gram, they have more than 1 million neurons, circuit density 10 times higher than our circuit density, vastly complex. Nobody has ever sort of analyzed that vast complexity. They can waggle dance. They have if you remember how long it took you to find a house, they can find a new nest in 3 days using 300 scouts. If you look at it, it's an amazing complex computation that these guys are capable of. They can recognize individual faces. So based on their complexity of the nervous system, based on the complexity of behavior, it's very difficult to argue that they don't feel like something. Now, once again, they don't have a voice in their head, but that's very different from saying that these are just automata, which is what we, particularly here in the West, sort of are led to believe they're just bugs. Then, of course, it raises the question, well, what about animals? What about all multicellular eukaryotes? And then what about all life? So this is a principle that dates back to Leibniz. Darwin was very fond of it, right? For evolutionary continuity, there's nothing really unique in nature. There's always a great continuity across all phyla, across all different animals. Well, if you have that principle, in fact, the last book that Darwin wrote was on worms. And somewhere in the book he says there is no Rubicon that separates simple creatures that are non-sentient from creatures that are sentient. It's a continuum. So it goes back to this very ancient philosophical school called panpsychism. Panpsychism, everything has mind. That experience is much more widespread than we like to believe. So yes, it may feel like something to see some of those creatures, those single-cell creatures that you saw on the various movies. Once again, this idea doesn't say that they have complicated emotions or anything like that, but the claim is it feels like something to be a worm, and when you take the worm apart into its constituent component, when it dies, it doesn't feel like anything anymore. That's a critical difference. All right, so let me come to the two dominant theories today. So today, if you go to consciousness meetings, scientific meetings that are just about consciousness, you find among scientists two models. One is called the global neuronal workspace. It's particularly associated here in Europe with Stan Dehaene and Pierre Changeux in Paris. So they claim, they work on the assumption that's relatively common, particularly in Silicon Valley, that consciousness is a particular type of information processing. That it's a property of particular type of information processing, in their case having to do with globally broadcasting information, which is why it's called global workspace. Once information gets into the brain, once it's globally available, it gets into the prefrontal cortex and it's sent to everybody. That act in making it globally available, that is what consciousness is. Okay, so that's one theory. And there's a huge amount of literature I'm not going to discuss. There's the other theory, very popular theory, called integrated information theory. That's very different. It takes sort of a much more fundamental Aristotelian point of view. It says it's a mathematical theory, so for any particular system, it can compute certain quantities. And it says ultimately any conscious experience, any experience the same, is a this doesn't really mean anything to you. It's identical to the maximal. Essentially, what it says, consciousness is causal power of the system upon itself. It's an identity theory. It says that's what conscious experience is. It's identical to intrinsic cause-effect power. You can map every conscious experience onto intrinsic causal power of any system, and nothing is left over. And you can measure the quantity, but not the quality of the irreducible of the system. Using a measure called integrated information. It's a number, and it tells you how much a system exists for itself. Again, it recalls Aristotelian notions of the whole versus the sum. It's a very different animal from a global neuronal workspace. And now I'll show you how these two different theories, because this is the future. So there are now conferences organized around this. There's an attempt to try to find experiments to test these different predictions of these two different theories. So there are a number of very counterintuitive predictions that integrated information theory has that I have to admit I favor. Okay, so it predicts that the neural correlate of consciousness, whatever it is, in us or in birds or in squids or in bees, is going to be structures that maximize this integrated information. It says that experience is very widespread in the animal kingdom, that even single cells have some experience. So if you look at a paramecium, or one of these single cell organisms that we only discovered 1628 or something, even a small of these organisms may contain 10 million proteins, 3,000 different types of protein, vastly exceed the computational power of anybody who's ever tried to model this. And of course, we don't have the knowledge of the interaction of 5,000 proteins, each present in various numbers in a single cell. So there's vast complexity there, even in individual cells, that we're unable to understand at this particular point in the history of science. It makes some very interesting prediction that you can test in animals or potentially also in humans. It makes a prediction there are no group minds, there's no collective minds. You can sort of do the inverse of split brain experiments. So Mike Zanigat told you about his beautiful these weren't experiments, but conclusion based for when the neurosurgeon cuts one brain, the two cortical hemispheres in two to prevent spread of epileptic seizure from one to the other. You can also do the inverse experiment. Right now it's only a thought experiment. You can two brains, like my brain and the brain of my wife that's somewhere in the audience, and we can try to connect our brains to each other. And what the theory predicts, as you increase sort of the number of connections between my neurons and her neurons, just like you add an artificial corpus callosum, at some point abruptly at a point defined by the integrated information between our two brains, when that integrated information among our two brains exceeds the integrated information in my brain or in her brain, I will die, Christof will disappear, her conscious mind will disappear, and there will be this new thing, this new entity. It's one mind, but now it has 4 cortical hemispheres. It sees the world through 4 eyes and 4 ears. It's one mind. So it comes at the cost of individuality. There's nothing perfect. So in principle, you can do this in animals, and I'm sure people will do this. So it's a little bit like the Borg, from the Star Trek universe, because this is exactly what happens in the Borg. If if Captain Picard, sort of is taken up by the Borg, he loses his consciousness, but he enlarges the consciousness of the whole. IET predicts the existence of states of pure consciousness, which is very interesting if you care about so-called mystical states or if you care about meditation. And it makes a very surprising prediction. It predicts that the causal power, the intrinsic causal power of computers, you have to look at the hardware. It's not about software. Ultimately, consciousness is created, if you want, by the ability of a system to influence its own state, to be influenced by its previous state, its past, and to be influenced by its future state. Spinoza had this beautiful phrase talking about they're pregnant with the future of their possibilities. Computers, if you analyze them rigorously, as you can do at the level of the gate, given their architecture, which is very different from the architecture of neurons, have minimal cause-effect power. And the cause-effect power they have they have doesn't depend on the software. This has a few very surprising consequences I'll come to in my almost last slides. So in a strict sense, per IIT, experience has no function. It's just part of the universe. It's part of the fabric. It's a naturalist theory. It says physics is incomplete. Physics describes only the relationship, the extrinsic relationship. The way physical systems feel from the inside, that's conscious experience. So the way my brain feels from the inside, the maximum of cause-effect power, that's my experience. And nobody in physics would ask, well, what's the evolutionary function of electric charge? However, through evolutionary pressure, and you can show this very nice with simulation, using simulated life, evolutionary pressure will lead to systems that have high integrated information. Because when you have high integrated information, you can process complex information that comes in through your sensors much better. So the important thing is, and makes it very different from global neuronal workspace. Global neuronal workspace is a theory about input-output transformation. It's about computation. Ultimately, it's about behavior. It's about function, and it's about behavior. Right? Ultimately, global neuronal workspace says, well, ultimately, it's a particular type of computation. You take input, you do something with it, or you store it, or you make it globally available, and then you control some output processes. IIT is not. You cannot compute your way to consciousness. You have to build it into the system. It's about intrinsic cause-effect power. So it makes some very different predictions. So it's rather interesting where we now have two scientific theories of consciousness. This one is a functional theory. As I said, it's very popular among the Silicon Valley crowd. It has a particular NCC, and you can debate, is that the right one or the wrong one? It does say very conclusively that once software implements this global broadcasting and you get sophisticated self-monitoring, then the machine will have experiences. Maybe not like us. Now it depends on the complexity of its sensory, of its internal representation, but it will experience something. So just to give you one intuition why per IIT. So if you have a colleague, she's an astrophysicist, and she can simulate on her laptop, she can write down in Python programming language the 9 equation that underlie Einstein Field's equation of general relativity. And she can predict that the solar mass at the center of our galaxy there, 10 to the 6 million solar masses, will be a black hole. In other words, it becomes so powerful, it twists space-time around it so much that nothing can escape, not even light. So that's why it's called black hole. But funny, you don't worry about her safety. Because in a sense, well, if it really simulates the gravitational, why wouldn't she be sucked into her simulation? Right, so this gives rise to the question that's really non-trivial. Where's the difference between the real and the simulated? The claim is that my software running on this computer simulates the situation of the black hole. Well, but it doesn't have any, there is some relationship between variables that are simulated in my laptop and the variables out there at the center of our galaxy. But the simulation doesn't have the causal power of gravity. So therefore, it's impotent. It doesn't twist, it doesn't affect space-time around it. Same thing with consciousness. We will come soon in our lifetime, certainly in your lifetime of the majority of members of the audience, will come to a place where there will be creatures like super-evolved Alexas that can talk, that can move. They will claim they're conscious, and they will simulate consciousness, and they will insist that they are conscious. But to use an idiom that somebody in the White House uses a lot, it's all fake consciousness. Now you can build, there's nothing magic, there's nothing supernatural about the human brain. If you want to get human-level consciousness, you have to build it into the architecture. And people are doing that, some people are doing that, it's called neuromorphic architecture. And so, do you know this movie? Best science fiction ever. Blade Runner. So you can ask, these all portrays various protagonists, Blade Runner, Ex Machina, Ava, and Westworld, where we can ask, and ultimately the challenge of the next 100 years is we're going to be confronted with very, very complex cognitive entities. And this gives rise to the question, to what extent are they conscious? And this question is not just abstract, but it has very concrete consequences. I'm not talking about existentialist risk here. I'm talking about the ethical consequences. Because we believe, all of us believe, as a society certainly, that if you're conscious, you have a special moral status. The moral status of my refrigerator is very low. I can do with it what I want. Nobody's going to get upset. I can beat it with a hammer, and that's my thing. It's just an object. But if I abuse my dog, people will rightfully call the police on me, and I'll be shamed on public media. Why is that? Well, because we believe the dog is conscious and therefore has certain rights. And this can be justified on different grounds. You can use existentialist justification. So you can say just for being, because if you're conscious, that's the only existence we're entitled to. Right? So we are bookended between two eternities, and the only real existence we have is that as conscious being. If we are zombies, then there's no life. If I'm a zombie, I don't experience life, and for me, that's like death. There is no difference between being a zombie and being dead. For me, as an intrinsic person. For you externally, of course, there is. Or you can say on sentient grounds, any creature that doesn't want to suffer, that doesn't want to end its life, has some moral rights. Or you can do it on the cognitive ground, which is dangerous, given the rise of these machines. You can say, well, any machine that has my level of cognitive complexity, that machine deserves special rights. And so if functionalism is true, which it's still an open question, then machines sooner or later will become conscious with all the attendant moral status and with all the challenges that's going to pose to us as society. And if a different view of consciousness is true, if it really requires causal power, then even artificial general intelligence, even if it became super intelligent, would not have special neural moral standing. You can just sort of click it off because you're not hurting anybody. There isn't anybody home there to hurt. It's just a sophisticated machine. This, of course, will conflict with our innate desire. I mean, why movies like Ex Machina and Westworld are so appealing to us? Because, of course, we impute agency. That's how we evolved. We cannot but help when we see a beautiful person, a beautiful woman in a movie, even though that was the point about Ex Machina, right? What's his name? Anyhow, the nerd, right? He perfectly well knew she was a robot, but he still fell in love with her and was manipulated. So we'll see how it goes over the next century. With that, I'm going to leave you with a last quote, again from Schrödinger's Mind and Matter. He says something that's not relevant. Was a necessary condition for the world to flash up to itself in the light of consciousness. Would it otherwise have remained a play before empty benches, not existing for anybody, thus quite properly speaking, not existing? I think it's a wonderful metaphor to end my talk. Thank you very much.